I was in, I think, an electronics shop, purchasing a transistor radio. As is the way these days, both in the brochure and the assistant congratulated me for doing this. This, of course, was ridiculous. It wasn't my birthday, I wasn't getting married, there was nothing to be congratulated about. In the case of you purchasing this video, it's an entirely different matter. You are to be congratulated because you have decided to make that step to learn an instrument. And it might possibly, as it did in my case, entirely change your life. Learning to play an instrument is hard work. If anybody tells you any different, they're wrong. However, it's also one of the most exciting and rewarding and fun things that you could ever do. Whether you want to play an instrument for your own amusement, just to play it to friends perhaps, or impress people at parties, or maybe become one of the great exponents of all time. Any of these things are now within your grasp, but you have to have a good grasp of basics. That's the basics. And that's what this video sets out to teach you. It assumes you have no knowledge of the instrument whatsoever and are starting entirely from scratch. If you follow this video through step by step, by the time you come to the end, you will have a good working knowledge of the instrument, enabling you to decide what type or style of music you wish to play. Of course, there is no substitute for practice, that's the big key to it, and even just as soon as you get to grips with whatever instrument it is, just one note I always found when I started to play, just by getting some sort of a rhythm on one note, gets you the feel of the instrument. And then just adding something else as a simple harmony. It's such a pleasure. Start by playing the video all the way through. It will give you a good idea of the journey, that's the musical journey that you are embarking upon, and the structure of the course. You will notice the program is in sections which you can easily find. Try to complete a section and don't move on until you feel comfortable and ready. When the tutor demonstrates a piece or section, try playing along until you're happy with the way that you sound. Keep practicing. That's the essence of learning any instrument. The beauty of this way of learning is that you are in control and you can choose the time and speed at which you learn. So we have chosen one of the best around to teach you. Accomplished drummer Jeff Nichols, featured in TV's Rock School, has played in every type of musical situation, from reggae to free jazz, from rock and blues to West End musicals and big bands.
Most people who are attracted to drums start like this, tapping on anything they can find and driving everybody mad, and some of us never stop. And that's probably not a bad thing, because the art of drumming is in getting different sounds and textures from different instruments by using coordination. And in fact, it's the coordination that puts people off. You hear people saying things like, I could never play drums because I can't get my four limbs to do different things at the same time. Well, actually, a moment's consideration will tell you that that's nonsense, because most of us learn to ride a bike or drive a car, and these activities require constant attention of the eyes and the ears whilst using all four limbs in a different sort of way. And that's exactly the same coordination that you require to become a drummer. Now obviously you can develop that skill to a very high level, and that depends on your determination and your innate ability. However, with this very, very basic, right from the beginning course, I reckon that just about anyone who stuck at it and had a little go should be able to get right through to the end. And there's just a couple of things to mention. If you do get into trouble, 2 cardinal rules. 1, do it slowly. You can do it as slowly as you like and you'll find it'll work. And number 2, if you get into difficulties, take it apart, do it 1 limb at a time, because doing all 4 limbs together, it is tricky, so do it 1 limb at a time and gradually build it up. To most people, the drum kit does look pretty complicated, particularly if you compare it with a single instrument like the guitar or the saxophone. And indeed the reason is because the drum kit is a collection of different instruments played by one individual. And if we go back to the marching band origins of the drum kit, we'll find that the bass drum, the side drums, the cymbals and so on are played by separate individuals. And the idea with the kit is that one individual attempts to copy what all those individuals would do separately in a coordinated fashion to play the kit as one. So let's look at the different parts of the kit. The bass drum now is sat on the floor and it's held upright by the spurs, which fold in to the side and which also stop it moving forward. It's played by a beater, a foot pedal, and this has spring tension on it which you can adjust to suit your technique. It has a beater, the stroke of which you can adjust to get a wide arc or a short arc, and the beater itself, the head of the beater, can be made of different sorts of materials. This is a hard felt beater, but you can also get wooden ones or plexiglass, various different kinds of material. The other important drum at the centre here is the snare drum. Now this is so called because if we look at the bottom of the snare drum, it's got a snare stretched across it. And the effect this has is to change the sound from this to this. The other important thing about the snare drum is it's very often made from a different material from the rest of the drum. As you can see, the rest of these drums are made from wood, whereas this drum has got, as you can see, a brass shell with steel hoops. And this other drum that we have here, this is actually an aluminium alloy, which is very light metal, again with steel hoops. But you can also get snare drums made from bronze, even graphite, as well as wood. And also the depth of the snare drum makes quite a lot of difference. So you can have a very thin 3-inch piccolo snare drum, right through to 8 or 9 inches, or even deeper sometimes, which is obviously going to give you a deeper sound. The commonest sort of snare drums are this sort of middle size here, 6.5 inch or maybe 5 inch. That sort of size like the other one we've just seen. The other drums here are called tom-toms, and the ones that are mounted on the bass drum are called hanging toms, and you can position them where you want by messing with this bass drum mount holder here. So you can position them just where you want them to be able to play them. The larger tom-toms are called floor tom-toms, and they either have legs of their own or they can be on a floor stand nowadays sometimes. The range of sizes is quite enormous. You can get from 6 or 8 inches right through to 18 inches across. What we've got here is a sort of a middle range, 10 inch, 12 inch, 14 inch, and these 2 toms on the bass drum, these are called power toms because they're quite deep. They're a couple of inches deeper than what used to be the standard size. So you can get standard size toms and you can get these power toms, which obviously give you a little bit more punch, a little bit more depth. Okay, let's move on to the cymbals. Perhaps the most interesting of the cymbals are the hi-hats. And these are a pair of horizontally mounted cymbals, 13 or 14 inches in diameter usually. The bottom hi-hat cymbal is usually heavier, that is thicker than the top one, and it's sometimes got a wavy edge or holes drilled into it so that when the hi-hat closes, the air can get through and you get a sharper sort of sound. The hi-hat's a very versatile little instrument actually in its own right. We'll just play a couple of bars. Okay, you can play all sorts of different rhythms on the hi-hat. Now I'm going to go right across to the other side of the kit, and the other cymbal that you can play rhythms on is called the Ride Cymbal, which is quite a heavy cymbal. And it's called a ride cymbal because you play continuous patterns on it. If you play on this part of the cymbal, rhythms like this one, say. But it's also got a bell in the middle, which is a much harder, thicker piece of metal. And when you play on that, you get a really cutting sort of sound. I'll do a couple of bars on there as well. Now, as you said, it's a thicker sound so that you can play those patterns on it. These other cymbals, the one at the top here, these are called crash cymbals, and they're usually thinner. So if, for instance, I try to play a ride pattern on this little thin one here, it'll build up into a wash, like this. Okay, it just washes. So obviously that's better for sort of splash accents. Dramatic parts in the rhythm, and the size of these cymbals can range right from this little one over here. That's a 10-inch, but you can actually get them right down to 6 inches, and they can go all the way around. This is an 18-inch one over here, but you can have them bigger than that. You can have 20-inch, 21, 22 even. And finally, this strange-looking job over here. This is a China cymbal. And this gives a sort of a trashy sort of sound. Quite often they're played upside down. You can use this for a ride, but you get a very, very open sound. So you can use it for a ride or for a crash sound. I'll just hit it there once so you can get the idea. Are we ready? So you can see that each part of the drum kit has its own particular function, and when you realise that, it doesn't look quite so complicated after all. And in fact, it's no accident that these particular instruments have come together to form the basis of the modern kit, because if we go back to the roots of popular music in song and dance, you could say that the bass drum is the equivalent of stamping your feet, and that the snare drum takes the place of hand claps, and that the ride cymbal and the hi-hat they would take the function of shakers, or the modern equivalent, which is like the tambourine. And if we put all those things together, we'll get a recognisable rhythm. Finally, we come to the tom-toms. Nowadays, they're most often used for fills, but you can actually use them in a ride fashion. You can play a very simple rhythm like this. Or you can actually play whole rhythms just on the tom-toms, and the most familiar and obvious one in rock music would be this one. And there you have it, the modern drum kit. Now, if you're just starting out, obviously you're not going to go out and buy a really expensive kit like this one. In fact, the first thing you should do, obviously, is to buy a pair of sticks. And actually, in choosing a pair of sticks, it's quite a bit of a minefield. The first thing you should look for, particularly if you're buying cheap ones, is that they're straight and they're not warped. Now, to make sure they're not warped, very easy test, you just roll them on the counter. If they're warped at all, you'll notice straight away. The next thing is, you want them to be balanced and to be the same weight. So what you do is you just tap them, and you should find that they feel the same weight and that they make the same sort of pitch sound on the tabletop. This is because sticks cut from different parts of the tree, they can be the same size, but they may actually be different weights. So what you're after is a nice balanced pair of sticks. Another good thing to do is just to check that the grain runs straight through to the tip, because then there's a better chance that it's going to be quite strong. Now, the actual size of the sticks, that depends largely on the size of your hands, what sort of music you want to play, your age perhaps, because if you're very young, be careful not to get really heavy sticks because you want to be a heavy metal player or something, because you might strain your hands and your fingers before you've got used to playing. So the classification is quite tricky. You should be able to get quite a lot of help from your local drum store, but as a general rule, a light pair of sticks are denoted by the letter A, 7A, 5A. A heavier pair of sticks by the letter B. So these are 5B, and you can get 2B. And somewhere in the middle, the average sort of stick, which I suppose probably most people use, sometimes they're denoted as a C. But it's a middle sort of range of stick, and as I say, your local drum store will help you out there. Okay, let's move on to what to buy first. Now, you can actually just start off with a practice pad, any sort of rubber pad, which you can put on any surface, and immediately you can tap away. People get very bored with this pretty quickly, so obviously you want to buy a real drum, and the first drum to buy is, of course, a snare drum. And I've actually got a snare drum here, which is quite cheap, but is of a very good quality. There are a few things to look out for. First of all, the actual tension rods here, the bolts that go into the tension brackets, I'm afraid you're going to have to look at every one. And this applies to the whole kit. If you go beyond buying a snare drum and buy a kit, always look at every rod. Make sure that they all turn properly in the lugs here, because sometimes you can get cross-threading, or they can even be missing. If some of them are missing, it doesn't matter because you can replace them, but if you've got cross-threading, then obviously you're in a little bit more trouble. And also sometimes the actual rim, the hoop, the metal hoops, sometimes they get damaged and bent, so that can prevent you getting the drum key on to tighten the bolt up. That can also cause a problem. The next thing to look for on a snare drum is that the strainer, the actual thing that strains the snare, make sure that that's in good working condition, that it's actually working on the strainer side and on the other side, the butt side. The actual snare itself, make sure that that isn't damaged. Sometimes you get snare wires broken off and so on. And the string that's holding it on, which is sometimes string or sometimes a tape, make sure that those are all there and they're all in good condition. They can obviously be replaced, but sometimes when you're buying second hand, it's difficult to get hold of the parts, and if you can't get them, then you're stuck. The snare drum's useless. So make sure you've got all those things. Okay. Now, the sort of order in which you then go on to buy things, I would say snare drum, first of all, and don't forget that every time you buy a piece of kit, you need the hardware to hold it up. So you buy a snare drum, you're going to need a snare drum stand. Then you move on to the hi-hats, hi-hat pedal, hi-hat cymbals. With those two, you can play a nice rhythm. Then you'd add the bass drum, and again, you're going to need a bass drum pedal. Then you can start adding cymbals and tom-toms as you wish. Make sure that they're all compatible. Sometimes what can happen with tom-toms, if you say you bought a bass drum and then you want to add some tom-toms, how are you going to mount them onto the bass drum? If you've got the wrong sort of mount, then you're in trouble. And in fact, the easiest answer to this actually is that if you're really keen on drumming and you've got your sticks and you've tried practice pad, maybe you've tried a snare drum and a hi-hat for a little while, if you really feel it's for you, you're probably better off buying a cheap whole kit, because kits, particularly those produced in the Far East now, they're so cheap. The value is so good that it's almost, you're better off and it's safer to buy the whole kit. Just make sure that it's working okay. Now what you mustn't forget is that when you buy a drum kit, you don't get the cymbals. And this is quite a shock to many parents that the cymbals can cost more than the drums. So all the major cymbal manufacturers make cheap lines of cymbals, and they're perfectly good. They're perfectly good for start, the same as the drum kits are perfectly good for starting out. And there's a few things to look at with cymbals. In fact, cymbals are more likely to get damaged than drums. There are several common problems. With this one, what's happened is that the centre hole here has been very badly damaged. And now the reason that's happened is because someone hasn't taken care of the cymbal stand. That's someone being me, I'm afraid to say. And at the top of each cymbal stand, you must make sure that you've got a nylon centrepiece, a little nylon tube or plastic tube, and that you've got plenty of felts on either side, so that the cymbal is protected in the middle. Because this cymbal has now started to bend. It hasn't affected the sound very much, but very soon it will start to crack. And cracking, of course, is the big problem with any piece of metal. And if you have a look at this one, now as you can see with this one, it's been scalloped out, which has been done with a metal saw and then filed down smooth. And the reason it's been scalloped out was because it started to crack. There's a hairline crack there. Now, by scalloping it out, this cymbal actually survived another several years. But eventually this hairline crack will appear, and they're quite tricky to notice sometimes. So you'll get the cymbal home and play it a couple of times and it'll fall to bits. So be very much on the lookout for that. Having said that, I think those are the major points to look out for, and we'll move on. Just like any other instrument, drums need tuning before you can play them. The only difference is with melodic instruments, you tune them to very specific pitches, A, B, C, D and so on, and they're either in tune or they're not. With a drum, what you do is you tension it until it feels and sounds good to you, and at that point, as far as you're concerned, it's in tune and no one can tell you any different. And this is the first and the biggest area of drum mystique. It causes a lot of problems for drummers. And I've been lucky enough over the last few years to talk to quite a few of the world's great drummers, and as far as I can make out, what most of them do is they come across their own method of tuning via a process of trial and error. However, there are certain common points and rules of thumb that we can go into in a moment, so don't get too disheartened. The first thing to realise is that most of the sound comes from the head. And as a sort of proof of this, if we look at these rototoms here, if I hit a couple of them, you can hear, I hope, that they make quite a lot of noise and they don't have shells. So what the shell on a proper conventional drum kit does is it alters the sound, adds timbre to the sound, projection and all the rest of it, but most of the sound is in the first place coming from the head. Now, given that, it's amazing how many drummers only change the heads very infrequently. So you're always coming across kits with heads in this sort of condition. These are old ones that I've taken off. As you can see, this is what happens to a head when it's been played a fair amount. It starts to get pitted and dented, and at that point it loses all its spring, and loses a lot of its tone and brightness. It's amazing. You can go to a second-hand junk shop and buy a really cheap old kit, and it's almost certainly going to have battered heads on it. And just by putting new heads on that kit, you'll be amazed how much you can give it a new lease of life. So it's well worth bearing in mind. Okay, what sort of heads? You saw a couple of different ones then. There's an amazing variety of heads on the market now, and they all give slightly different sound character. So they range really from something, these are all ones that I've used. This is a double thickness, double layer of plastic, quite thick plastic, what's known as a rock head, which gives a very deep sort of blatty sort of sound. It's got a colour pigment in it as well, and you can get all sorts of different colours, and the actual colours affect the sound just slightly, but you can hear the difference. And they go right through to a much thinner head like this one. This is a single thickness thin head, which is going to give you a much more bright and resonant sound. You can get a single thickness one like this, which has got a coating on, which is more like a traditional head. The coating is quite good, gives you a nice stick feel, but also very good if you want to play brushes. And another extreme, this is a fabric woven head with a film of plastic over the edge to keep it watertight and weatherproof and so on. So you must bear in mind that the actual head that you use will affect the sound. Just finally, one other type of head which is also very popular on the Rototoms here. This has got, it's a single layer, but it's got a reinforcing black spot in the middle, and that sort of dampens a little bit of the sound. So the thicker heads, some of the resonance is dampened out, some of the overtones are dampened out, gives you a rockier sort of sound. Now, to tune a drum, I'm going to take this drum from down here. Obviously you take the hoop off and get yourself a head. Clean it up round here, check your bearing edge is nice and clean and smooth. If at this point you find that your bearing edge is in a terrible state, that's going to make it very difficult to tune. So you can think about giving it a little bit of very, very light sanding if you've got little bits of whatever on it. But to get it absolutely level is very much a specialist job. So you have to be very careful about that. Just bear in mind that the bearing edge is very important. To get a head nicely tuned, if the bearing edge itself is uneven, then it's going to be very, very difficult to get the drum head even. So you just place the head on, put the collar back over, and do all the tension rods up to finger tight, like this. Okay, so we've got them all up to finger tight, like this. Then you take the key, drum key, and either working around the head or diagonally like this, put an equal number of turns at each point. Working crisscrossing like this. Try and get it more or less as even as you can. Okay, now if it's a new head, at that point you want to seat it, and you can press quite hard on these heads. I'm pressing that in quite hard. Take it up another turn. So what I've done now is I've gone past the point at which I know it's going to end up. So this should be quite pingy now, I would think. But that's still within the acceptable range of what this drum can take. Just how high or how low you tune your drums is a matter of what you feel, you know, what sounds good to you and what feels nice to you when you play on them, and perhaps what sort of music you're playing. But once you go beyond a certain point, you'll soon know that it's too high for the drum. it'll just start to sound very, very thin indeed. Conversely, if you go too slack, you'll start to get wrinkles in the head, and you'll just get a complete flat blat with a load of rattling going on. You'll know straight away. So somewhere in between those 2 points is the point that you're aiming at. Now personally, I will go for something a little bit down from that, so I'm going to take it back down again. And I've tried to keep it fairly even at each stage. Now this is a process that might take you quite a long while. Some people may be studio musicians who do a lot of studio playing where the drums are under the spotlight, so to speak. They might find themselves doing this every day, so they become very, very expert at it. Can do a drum in a few minutes. For anyone else, it might take you quite a long while, but it's time worth, well spent. So I've cut back down to the sort of area. That's the sort of area that I personally like for this sort of drum. And what I'm going to do now is start tapping about an inch and a half in from each tension rod to see what the actual pitch is next to each rod, and the aim is to get the same pitch at each rod. So I'll just quickly tap round here. I know we're going to be able to hear this very well. It's a little bit higher there. I'm going to take a fraction off. Just a fraction, just a tiny little bit maybe. Now by a process of total luck, that head is actually pretty close. Not quite right with the bottom one, but the actual top one is fairly well in tune with itself. Now it might take quite a lot. I mean, sometimes you can get ahead and it's murder. You can spend half an hour going backwards and forwards, round and round in circles. If you get into that situation, it's better take it right off and start all over again, because what's usually happened is you've pulled it over to one side, something like that. But take it off, start again. But as I say, your end result is to try and get it more or less the same. Once you've done that, you can turn your attention to the bottom head. Now I've got a slightly thinner head on the bottom, a resonant head. So a resonant head will be a little bit brighter than this slightly heavier top head. Nonetheless, I personally try to get it to the same pitch. That way, for me, I have less problems with the whole kit ringing. It just gives it a clearer note for my personal taste. But you can experiment with having the bottom head a little bit lower than top one, or you can experiment with having it a little bit higher than the top one, and it will give you slightly different effects. You'll just have to experiment with those and see what you think. Now, the next thing to realise is that you haven't just got one, but you've probably got several toms. So we've got 3 on the kit here. And there are all sorts of different intervals that you can go for on the toms. And this depends very much on the size of the toms and the way you tune and the sort of sound that you want to get out of them. But with a spread of 3 toms, these two are quite close in size, and this one's quite a lot bigger. So